The War Room Below Ground. While the copper kings of the East, Morgan and Rogers, conducted their business in the rarefied air of Wall Street boardrooms, Gus Heinze established his command center deep within the earth of Butte. His true war room was not an office, but the underground tunnels of the Rarest mine, one of the smaller properties he had acquired. To understand the enemy, Heinze knew he had to feel the enemy's ground. For weeks, he and his chief engineer, a gruff, loyal Cornishman named Josiah Peneligan, spent their days nearly half a mile beneath Butte, studying the geology like generals studying a battlefield map. The principle of extralateral rights was based entirely on geology. To win, Heinze had to prove unequivocally that the rich lode, the vein of valuable copper ore that began vertically within the boundary of his small surface claim, then angled sharply downward and continued uninterrupted into the vast subterranean workings of the amalgamated's behemoth, the Neversweat. If the vein was broken, fractured, or dipped in any way that suggested a new geological formation, the claim was void. "They've mined everything above the 1,500-foot level, Gus," Peneligan rasped, wiping sweat and mine dust from his brow, his headlamp casting a weak yellow cone on the glistening, sulfide-rich rock face. "Their engineers say the Rarest vein pinches out before it gets anywhere near their main stope." Gus, whose hands were still soft from his New York upbringing, but whose resolve was granite, pointed to a shimmering seam of chalcocite, rich black copper ore, running along the hanging wall. "But Josiah, does it really pinch out, or does it merely narrow?" This was the crux of the billion-dollar argument. The law was ambiguous enough to be interpreted by a favorable judge. Heinze's team didn't just rely on geology, they relied on subterranean espionage. He hired and paid handsomely the miners who had worked for Amalgamated but were disgruntled by the low wages and autocratic management. These men provided Heinze with detailed, hand-drawn maps of the Neversweat's lower levels, maps that Amalgamated considered top secret. They confirmed his theory. The Neversweat's engineers, either through arrogance or error, had simply stopped following the Rarest vein when it narrowed, assuming it was uneconomical or simply ended. Heinze knew better. He started tunneling, running a small, high-risk, high-speed drift, a lateral passage, from the Rarest, guided by his informant's intelligence, straight toward the heart of the Amalgamated's territory. This was literally burrowing for evidence, a subterranean dare. The People's Injunction. Heinze's strategy was twofold: legal precision and popular opinion. He understood that in Montana, a territory fiercely independent and resentful of the East Coast trusts, the courts could be swayed by the will of the people. He launched a public relations campaign unprecedented for a legal case. He bought advertisements in the Butte Miner newspaper, not to discuss legal statutes, but to paint Amalgamated Copper, the Morgan Rockefeller Trust, as the true foreign invader, taking Montana's wealth and refusing to share it. His message was simple: Amalgamated steals your copper. I, Augustus Heinze, fight to keep Montana's gold and copper for Montanans. He started the Montana Ore Purchasing Company, MOPC. While still fighting his lawsuits, he began buying ore from all the small, independent miners whom Amalgamated had tried to crush with low prices and processing monopolies. He paid better wages and offered better prices for their ore. He became the populist savior. When he finally brought his first major lawsuit to the desk of Judge Clancy, the courtroom was packed. The mood was not just tense, it was revolutionary. The crowd wasn't there for a legal proceeding, they were there for a show of force against the titans of Wall Street. Amalgamated's legal team, a phalanx of highly paid, impeccably dressed lawyers shipped in from San Francisco and Chicago, opened with condescension. They presented volumes of geological reports, arguing that Heinze's claims were frivolous and vexous, designed only to extort money. They called Gus Heinze an opportunistic pestilence. When it was Heinze's turn, he did not dwell on the complex geological jargon of dips and spurs. He called forth a grizzled, limping miner from the stand, a man whose face was etched with 3 decades of work below ground. "Mr. O'Malley," Gus asked, speaking loudly for the benefit of the gallery, "when you were working the 1,800-foot level of the Rauris, did you notice a continued presence of chalcocite when you tunneled toward the Never Sweat line?" The miner, pulling off his worn cap, looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, that vein runs straight and true. She narrows a bit, yes, like a woman's waist, but she don't quit, and that trust knew it. They just didn't want to admit it, because if they followed her, they'd be on Mr. Heinze's property, and they'd have to pay him a fortune." That testimony, focusing not on legal documents, but on the common sense of the working miner, was the first shot fired. Within 48 hours, Judge Clancy issued his verdict, a massive, sweeping injunction against Amalgamated Copper. The Never Sweat mine, arguably the most productive copper hole on the planet, was ordered shut down immediately. The pumps were stopped, the cages were idled, and the 2,000 men who worked the mine were sent home. The news was a financial earthquake that rattled the foundations of Manhattan. For the first time, a small-time lawyer in a remote western town had managed to shut down a piece of the J.P. Morgan empire. The copper tide was starting to turn, and Augustus Heinze was standing at the helm, laughing.
Chapter 2. The Political Assassination Without Bloodshed. Morgan's Counterstrike. The Scorched Earth. The shockwave from the Never Sweat injunction hit 23 Wall Street with the force of a market crash. J.P. Morgan, a man who viewed any challenge to his authority as a personal insult, was furious. His lieutenant, Henry H. Rogers, the formidable head of the Standard Oil empire, received the orders: crush Heinze. Amalgamated Copper could not afford to allow a single mining claim to be shut down by a local judge and a populist lawyer. The shutdown alone cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars a day, and, more critically, it threatened their stock value in global copper supply agreements. Their counterattack was not legal. It was economic warfare designed to flatten the entire state of Montana. The blacklist. Amalgamated immediately ordered its affiliated railroads, smelters, and banks to blacklist any business, supplier, or contractor dealing with Gus Heinze or his Montana ore purchasing company. Heinze's ore now had no way to be shipped or processed. The lockout. In a move of calculated economic brutality, Amalgamated temporarily closed several of their other major mines. They blamed the shutdowns on the instability and ruinous litigation caused by Mr. Heinze, throwing thousands of miners, the very people who supported Heinze, out of work. The Panic Campaign. The powerful, Morgan-backed press began a relentless campaign painting Heinze not as a champion of the people, but as a reckless anarchist willing to starve Butte for his own greed. Butte was immediately plunged into a crisis. Miners loyal to Heinze's antitrust rhetoric were now facing empty larders and impending winter. Their populist hero had inadvertently brought famine to the city. But Gus Heinze, however, was prepared. He had anticipated the heavy hands of the trust. He owned a small bank, the State Savings Bank, and a company store. He immediately began issuing scrip, a private currency, and opened soup kitchens, effectively operating a rudimentary alternative social safety net. They control the copper, he declared in a fiery speech to the unemployed miners, but they do not control your will. We will feed ourselves and we will win. This brinkmanship couldn't last. The only solution was to control the ultimate lever of power in Montana, the governor and the U.S. Senate seat. The Senate seat strategy. At this time, U.S. senators were not elected by popular vote, but by a vote of the state legislature, making the position highly susceptible to bribery and corporate control. Amalgamated already owned many legislatures, a network meticulously constructed by their first copper king, Marcus Daly. Heinze needed a permanent legal solution, one that superseded the local Montana courts where Clancy sat. He needed the court that mattered most, the Supreme Court of the United States. For a case to be appealed there, it needed to be ruled on by a U.S. federal judge. The problem? The only person who could appoint a new U.S. federal judge for the District of Montana was a U.S. senator from Montana. Heinze decided that to win his mining war, he had to buy his way into the highest level of government. He would support his older brother, Fritz Heinze, in a campaign for the Senate. Simultaneously, William A. Clark, the second great copper king, Daly's rival, was also trying to buy the other available Senate seat. Clark, known for his crude ambition and vast wealth, viewed the Senate not as a duty, but as a gilded trophy. The result was the most expensive, corrupt, and absurd legislative session in American history. For weeks, the Montana state legislature, meeting in Helena, was deadlocked. Votes were bought, revoked, and resold hour by hour. Legislators were kidnapped, held in secret hotel rooms, and plied with liquor and cash to ensure their vote for either Clark's or Heinze's candidate. Clark eventually secured his seat through a legendary expenditure of bribes, a feat that later resulted in his censure, though not removal from the Senate. Heinze lost the initial vote, but he learned a crucial lesson. Political power was the key that unlocked the ideological power. The fateful telegram. The political deadlock led to the climax of the Butte War, the astonishing 1902 legislative session. The copper interests, Amalgamated, Clark, and Heinze, each backed rival candidates for the state offices. The gridlock was total. The state government ground to a halt. Montana had become a failed state run by warring copper barons. Finally, Wall Street was tired. Morgan and Rogers sent their final devastating order to their operatives in Montana: end the war. They realized they couldn't beat Heinze in court, and they couldn't bankrupt him fast enough with their blacklist. They had to remove his greatest, most effective weapon, Judge William Clancy. They couldn't physically assassinate him. That was too messy. They chose a method far more brutal and absolute: political assassination. Using their leverage over the newly elected governor and the state Supreme Court, Amalgamated engineered an unprecedented act. They passed a bill abolishing the District Court of Silver Bowl County, where Butte was located and where Clancy sat, and simultaneously created a new court with a completely new jurisdiction. Judge Clancy's position, his salary, his jurisdiction, and his power to issue injunctions against Amalgamated vanished overnight. He was a judge one day and an unemployed private citizen the next. It was a perfectly legal, surgical strike, a complete legislative nullification of Heinze's entire legal strategy. All 134 of his pending lawsuits were thrown into limbo, forcing him back to square one. With his most powerful ally removed and his legal fortress dismantled, Gus Heinze realized the truth. The battle could no longer be fought in Butte. He packed his bags, sold off his few remaining profitable assets to fund his war chest, and headed east. He was moving his war from the richest hill on earth to the place where power truly resided. He was about to take his financial recklessness and his populist genius to the heart of the American banking establishment.